Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Need Some Introduction. I'm your host, Victor, and on this podcast, I try to hopefully introduce you, the listener, to something new, something old, something new to you, and provide some analysis along the way. In today's episode, I'll be breaking down this new season of The Bear. I'm intentionally avoiding social media reaction to the season until after I complete this initial episode of the podcast. But I have a feeling this is going to be a very divisive season for fans of the show. Before I get into that breakdown, I will be providing a couple of recommendations that fans of The Bear may want to catch up with. Both highly recommended, by the way. And before all of that, just the usual announcements. If you'd like to get even additional content, additional reviews, daily reviews practically, check out the link to my Letterboxd page. You do not have to be a Letterboxd member to read the reviews or follow me there. So check the link in the show notes if you're curious to read those reviews and some of these lists, these recommendation lists associated to these episodes. You can also email me. Check the show notes for the email link as well. And I probably will be checking out the social media reaction now that I've seen the entire season of the show. And also, Sona is catching up on the show this weekend. So expect probably early next week, yet another episode regarding this third season of the series, where I'll have a follow-up conversation with Sona, get her opinion of how this all played out, and reflect on it a little further with that additional context of popular reaction and critical reaction. And later in the week, Presumed Innocent's been very solid so far. This new adaptation of the Cicero novel on Apple TV+. And we are now past the mid-season of that series, and there'll be an episode catching you up on that and a conversation with Sona here in the same feed. So subscribe if you'd like to get that notification when that episode becomes available. And some of the biggest summer movies are coming out throughout the rest of the year. Expect to see an episode rounding up the first half of the summer, I guess first third of the summer season, and a bunch of reviews of those existing films and previews of some of the big titles coming later in the summer. All that is to come. Okay, to kick things off, my recommendations. Recommendation number 1. There's a short film called Boiling Point, a British 22-minute short film from back in 2019. Written and directed by Philip Barantini and starring Stephen Graham. And the premise of this short film is the same as the feature film, and maybe I'll just get to that immediately. You can rent this short film, but I bring it up for the fact that this was an experiment for a feature film, 22 minutes long, a single take, one of these films that is one single continuous take. And if that sounds familiar, you probably remember from the first season of The Bear, there is an episode exactly 22 minutes long, one single take. This is the one where Sydney leaves the overnight website open with the delivery requests, and then they turn on the machine and they're completely overwhelmed, and you've probably seen it. It's a very, very chaotic episode. So this was, to some extent, that short film was the germination point for the entire series of The Bear. And as this series was being written, the first season of the series, using that short film as a framing device in completely parallel development, Barantini was developing his short film into a feature-length film. And after all that preamble, that is my recommendation. It is available on Amazon Prime, very easy to find. Also available on Tubi, by the way, so basically anybody, at least in the US, can see this. I don't know how Tubi works in other regions, if Amazon Prime has the same licensing across the board, but I would figure that in many parts of the world, if you're hearing this right now, if you have Amazon Prime, and of course, if you have Tubi and don't even need to have Amazon Prime, you can watch this film. And this is the same thing, an extension of that short film, 1.5 hours long, a continuous single take. This thing must have had to have been rehearsed so many times to be able to shoot this continuously, an hour and a half. There are no hidden edits. It is a true 1.5 hour continuous take. Basically a live performance choreographed around the cameras. I can't imagine what the choreography must have been for the blocking for this whole thing. And if you like this fly on the wall, look behind the stressed out lives of being in a kitchen, any kitchen is stressful, but in this case, it is one of the highest end restaurants in London. It is leading up to Christmas. It's the busiest time for these restaurants in London proper. And Stephen Graham, the owner of the restaurant, who has addiction problems, who has interpersonal problems, is trying to successfully pull off this night. And of course, as you would expect in these type of movies, culminating around him, his interpersonal relationships are falling apart. A lot of His backstory is revealed through these continuous interactions between his staff, between his family members, between the different players in this scenario. And it is just this one very stressful shift. And it's very impressive, this 1.5 hour experiment, which is very satisfying. And as a matter of fact, has spun off a series. If you live in the UK on BBC, you can see a whole season of this show, Boiling Point. Also same name, same actor, Stephen Graham playing the lead. A lot of the same cast, actually. So all recommendations. The short film, but of course, most easy to see the feature-length adaptation. And of course, the series. If you can get your hands on it, check out the series as well. It's a very interesting feedback loop. The short film inspired The Bear. The Boiling Point, the success of that film in England, to some extent popularized The Bear, the series there. And then, of course, the success of The Bear leads to a TV series version of the movie. It's this interesting feedback loop. And if you're curious about all of that, if that sounds interesting to you, check it out. Like I said, the movie, at least, is available on Amazon Prime. Very easy to track down. Okay, second recommendation, a film called Pig. This one's a little tricky because there's a lot of movies called Pig, but it's called Pig. It's from 2021, starring Nicolas Cage. So that should make it pretty easy to track down. Available on Hulu and the Disney Plus bundle. If you have Disney, you get Hulu there as well. And available for free on Canopy, Knopy, a service that no one knows about, but I continuously reference here on the show. A lot of the recommendations I make here are available on Canopy, which is free to everybody with a library card. Most parts of the country anyway. But if you have a library card, or if you have a friend who has a library card that does support Canopy, create an account, link it to your library card or theirs, and just watch a lot of really great free content. Stuff you can't find anywhere else, by the way, for free. Hey, you pay your taxes, take advantage of it. Once again, that's called Pig. And this is the first feature film by director Michael Sarnowski, which I bring up one more time, by the way, because opening today, as I'm publishing this, or recording it anyway, Friday, the 27th, Michael Sarnowski is the director of the very well-reviewed new Quiet Place Day One, which is going to be, I was going to say number one this weekend. No, actually, Inside Out is going to be number one. Inside Out 2 continues this phenomenal run. We'll have to talk about the box office at some point in the future. But it is certain to open well and hopefully perform well, especially given those positive reviews. I'll definitely be checking it out very soon and probably have a review for it either here or on Letterboxd. So Michael Sarnowski, in his 20s, writes this film, somehow gets, I don't know all the details of this, but somehow gets the interest of Nicolas Cage and gets this relatively small budget movie made. And of course, like I mentioned, the success of that leads to this big budget directing job, directing this action horror film, whose budget is an order of magnitude higher, I'm sure. But if you know anything about Pig, I never saw the trailers for this, by the way, and I really went into this in exactly the correct frame of mind, I think. I can only imagine that people who are on board, like the internet meme generation, that went to see this film because they thought it was going to be another crazy, over-the-top Nicolas Cage performance, they must have walked out of this movie scratching their heads. And in no small part to the fact that the hook of this movie, the synopsis, even on Internet Movie Database, is that some guy, some crazy wild man in the woods, has his favorite pig kidnapped, and he goes on a revenge rampage. That's basically how this film was pitched. And I think intentionally, that is the tagline to kind of get people juiced to think like, oh my God, this is like John Wick with a pig instead of a dog, or this is like Liam Neeson, get me back my pig. So all that is to say that I did not go in with that context, not that expectation, I should say. And I imagine people who went in with that expectation must have been so disappointed. And then I eventually saw it more out of curiosity to say, wow, this Nicolas Cage film is getting a lot of positive reviews. I got to check this out. And I had seen Mandy, by the way, which is one of those crazy over-the-top Nicolas Cage. At least half the performance is crazy. The other half is actually very subdued. So I was starting to get back on board with Nicolas Cage, curious to see, well, why is everybody buzzing about this film? And this film, to me, is such a knockout because what the film is actually about is about, yes, this man, wild man living out in the outskirts of Seattle in the woods. And he does indeed have his pet pig, who is a truffle pig. It actually helps him find truffles. And he's supplying truffles to this young restaurateur. That's the setup, the first few minutes of the film. And yes, some people come and kidnap his pig But then what happens is not some crazy revenge film. What we see is this man on foot, literally going on this odyssey back through his life. And over each one of these interactions he has as he re-enters society, we start to discover that he was a restaurateur, a famous restaurateur, who has isolated himself because of some trauma in his past. And we discover some of the details of that trauma as the film progresses. And as he encounters each one of these people from his past, the film flirts with, and I guess this is probably why Sarnowski ends up getting a job directing a horror film and getting Nicolas Cage in this role. There is always this sense that things could take a turn. But what is so surprising about the film is that over the course of these interactions, it's actually Nicolas Cage's character's philosophy on life. These words that come from this person who's lost everything, literally, in the course of his life. And these different people who remained in society now running into him and their philosophical contradictions or conflicts, and how oftentimes these conflicts are resolved by the preparation of food. There's a scene here, a father-son reunion at one point, not to spoil things, where it's all resolved over the course of a meal, and it is really just beautiful. So I know you were not expecting that. If you've seen the trailer, you think this is going to be John Wick action movie or something. It is not. It is this deep rumination on loss, on giving up on things you were once passionate for, all things that honestly very tightly couple to the themes we see in this season of The Bear. So if you did like that aspect of the season of The Bear, then do check out Pig. I think it's underseen, probably because it never correctly identified its audience, and the people who should have seen it probably would not have gravitated to it, and the people who did see it expected a different movie, so they were maybe disappointed. But my experience was I was so surprised by it, and I just loved it. It was one of my favorite films of that year, and really impressive for this young writer-director. So check that out. It's on Hulu. It's on Canopy for free, so do check that out if you haven't seen it already, especially if you're a fan of The Bear and you like explorations of these particular themes. Okay, just popped into my head. A third recommendation. I think I've wanted to call this out before, may have even called it out before in one of the other episodes. One of my favorite films of the late 90s, whenever this film came out, a film called Big Night, which I'm just looking up on Just Watch, an app that tells you where to stream these things. That's where I get my information from. Available on Paramount Plus, or for rent, of course. Stanley Tucci and Campbell Scott directing together their first film they directed, I believe. A film about two brothers who own an Italian restaurant, Tony Shalhoub and Stanley Tucci, and also featuring Minnie Driver and Isabella Rossellini, and a lot of other very recognizable character actors. And the tension between these two brothers, the older brother, the artisan, the one who wants to make the food exactly the way it's supposed to be, and the younger brother, the producer, the money man. And of course, this is the reason that movies, stories about restaurateurs, and even friendships between artists and filmmakers specifically and restaurateurs, is because it's all the same tension. It is one person's vision, but only possible via the collaboration of a team. And of course, the constant battle between art and commerce. The artistic drive is what makes the food making, the filmmaking possible. That the passion is what fuels all of this labor. But then you need to appeal to the critics. And simultaneously, you need to find an audience. If people don't show up at your restaurant, it doesn't matter how great your reviews are. If a handful of critics love your film, unless you've made it on a shoestring, you won't be able to make another one because it won't be profitable. So there is this constant tension between how much you cater to the audience versus how much you let your own passion be your guide. And that is a tension between these two brothers, manifest in this Big Night film, and the food. Do not go to see this movie or watch it at home, I guess in this case, on an empty stomach, because you will be starving after you see it. So make a reservation at a good Italian restaurant for the evening after you watch this excellent movie, which has one of the most beautiful final moments, which features just the making of an omelet, which I would not be surprised at all if that is part of the inspiration for the omelet episode in season 2 of The Bear. Okay, those are the 3 recommendations, all available to stream, all available to rent on digital platforms, all excellent films. Okay, The Bear, season 3. There is definitely a meta commentary happening in this season of the television show. The first season of the series was a surprise. It came out in this window of time post-pandemic. It caught audiences and critics off guard. And like a magic trick, surprise has to be part of the recipe of a successful magic trick, something that is referenced directly in this series of television. So some of that magic, some of that surprise can only be in that first blush with these new creators, very new showrunners, many of these cast members practically unknown, some of them non-professionals at the point when they were cast in this series. Jeremy Allen White, of course, very recognizable from his very successful run on Shameless. But the rest of the cast, character actors that never had a chance to shine, or young actors that haven't had much TV experience at all. And of course, Eben Moss-Bachrach, who's been around for quite some time, very recognizable actor now getting this glow up, and Abby Elliott. And of course, Ayo Edebiri, who's just so huge right now in so many different projects as a writer, as a director, as an actress. And Lisa Cologne Zayas playing Tina, an actress who was a theater actress, primarily very long career, now finally having this moment of fame. In some ways, a metaphor for Tina's journey herself in the series. All really impressive performances here, but specifically in season 3, I do want to especially call out Lionel Boyce playing Marcus, an actor with very little experience. I know he's done some writing in the past as well. Looking at his resume, he's been in some Tyler, the Creator videos, but that's about it early on, other than maybe a guest appearance here and there in a bit part. And every season, it seems like they give him a little more to do. It's, once again, interesting metaphor for the show itself. I think that there's so much meta commentary in your relationship with this restaurant, with these characters, and with the show itself. Really has impressed me, especially in this season. He has to do a lot more. He has to show a lot more shadings to this character. And everything they throw at him, he does with aplomb. The season itself kicks off with this absolutely extraordinary first episode. The episode is called Tomorrow. And the synopsis of the episode is the next day and the days that led to it. And that's basically what it is. It is this prismatic mind palace of Carmi's experience. He has this deep burn on his hand, which I don't think we've ever noticed here on the show before. And he's in his apartment and he is reflecting the next morning immediately after the events of the conclusion of season 2. And in his mind, we see his journey of him leaving his family, the rejection of his brother, his interactions with his cousins in New York, with his sister as he leaves Chicago, the different famous, in this case, this star-studded cast. They all appear in cameos in this first episode, by the way. Everybody we've encountered here previously, and all the ways he's interacted with these different characters in these different restaurant situations, and his entire journey from someone who's passionate about this through the current moment. And there are moments of beauty, of the zen, of the flow state as he becomes more and more adept at this. But then the flashes of this toxic family dynamic that he's escaping to a large extent. And just to put a pin in that right now, this whole season of television is about different people thinking about why they do the things they do. If season 1 was about Carmi coming back home and trying to transform this restaurant from one thing into another, and if season 2 was about the birth of that thing, and I think that's why season 2 is really so satisfying, not only in the way it's structured, and I'll do a comparison in the structuring of these seasons, which is a bit of a critique I'll have later on. But on the positive side, you see how strong that is and how compelling that is as a viewer of these people all suddenly identifying this shared vision, and then how all their trajectories are intersecting, are all pointing in that one direction. Even as the characters in season 2, are out in different parallel storylines, their shared vision, their shared passion is driving them together to this intersection point, which is the birth of this new restaurant. So, of course, that's very satisfying. The building of something collaboratively allows a lot of parallel action, but still this driving force of this culmination that's coming. And what we see here in microcosm is that journey for Carmi as he's being driven by all these different things, but also laying out the themes here early on in this very first episode that also he is running away from something. And that's what is also pushing him forward. So the question that is being asked here more broadly is, what drives us? Are there positive motivators? Are there negative motivators? Do we need those negative motivators to get us to a certain point, but then do we need to let them go? Because if Carmi continues to run away from things, even if it keeps driving him forward, he's addicted, like so many members of his family are addicted to different things. He's addicted to that blade at his back, that constant need to push himself forward, that fear of turning around. But that can't be the only thing that motivates you. At some point, called out later in the season itself, the idea of like, where is the passion? Where is the fun? There has to be some upside to all of this work. And this is an incredibly well-made Christopher Storer directing here, the creator of the series and one of the creators of the series, doing an incredible job writing and directing. There's hardly any dialogue here, if any. I mean, just incidental dialogue, I believe. Incredible cinematography, just absolutely beautiful photographs of these locales, of the food itself, of the preparation of the food, of these intense close-ups of these people as they are single-mindedly focused on the task at hand, which of course is part of Carmi's motivator, if nothing else. And not only expertly made, but so generous to the audience, to be honest, because oftentimes, you take a year away. Most people are not seen this series, I should say, season 2 or season 1, in many months, a year maybe. Some people only watched it once. So you almost need a way to get caught up on where you left off. And for me, this was so exceptional because it not only reminds me of all these elements of the plot, of all these different characters, of all their interactions, of where we left off on season 2, it puts me right back in the headspace again of this show. So I could not speak more highly about this first episode of the show, but I can imagine people being turned off. There is literally a later episode where they're talking about the sandwich shop being open and how that is still generating money, whereas the much more expensive, much more esoteric version of the menu is not generating money. It may have a lot of people showing up, but those costs are high, so there's less money to be made. Once again, a metaphor for being a little maybe too esoteric in what you're trying to present. I personally, as someone who's been called a film snob to my face, I don't mind the esoteric. I often appreciate it. You can get a little too up your own butt and I don't appreciate that when it becomes just esoteric, but I definitely lean into someone who's taking a big swing, trying to be ambitious. So I really love not only the ambition, but the execution of this first episode. I also very much do not like when something's over-explained to me. And of course, nothing's over-explained. You have to fill in your own blanks. And I really do like that so much about this first episode. But it's like watching The Sopranos. I remember that experience of watching The Sopranos. It's very similar in some ways to The Bear, that sometimes the things I like the least about The Bear seem to be the things that a popular audience seems to embrace the most fully in the show. And then here we have, I want my beef sandwich and I want the esoteric restaurant. And there's a critique that maybe we're going too far towards the esoteric restaurant. And where's my beef sandwich? And maybe that's the argument that's being played out among the viewers of this show in this third season. To that point, we move on to episode 2. And I feel like this is very much straining to give us the beef sandwich here. They're trying to give us the interpersonal character dynamic, which drove so much of season 1. But I do feel it's a little strained here. And every time they lean a little too much in this direction, I bristled against it a little bit. There's a lot of yelling. There's a lot of heightening the interpersonal dynamics that I felt was a little grating, a little hysterical, as opposed to, by the way, I feel episode 2 is nearly redundant because we end up with another really excellent episode of the show in episode 3. And where we see there is similar, somewhat, to this lead up to Carmi today. As context setting, we now have the restaurants today after 1 month. And Carmi has written down in this manic OCD tempest all these non-negotiables, which of course he single-mindedly has defined. And one of them, part of them, maybe the most annoying one and the most self-sabotaging, is the idea that he wants to model the restaurant day one to be one of the best in the world. And he has taken the lessons he's gotten, not only the positive ones, but the negative ones as well. And he's internalized them. And he's trying to do all of that. He's trying to not choose, not subtract the good from the bad, or the bad from the good, I should say, but he wants it all. So this recipe, his version of this restaurant, is too much. Just like his recipes in the past when he was starting out were too ambitious. He wanted to have all the flavors he liked in a single dish. So subtract, subtract, subtract. And he has not learned that lesson in trying to lead with passion, collaborate, take a big swing, and also be incredibly rigid at your day-to-day when you show up, break down the cardboard as soon as it arrives. Actually, pretty good idea considering how overwhelmed they get by cardboard. I used to work at a liquor store, not the same as a restaurant. But if you let those boxes pile up, they got way out of control before you knew it. So Carmi still has not learned the lesson to subtract, and he just keeps adding and adding and adding, and he expects everyone to do everything and be on point. And of course, that includes changing the menu every day. Not every week, not every season, every day a new menu, which of course confuses the staff. They have to learn a new menu every single day. It also makes production costs much higher because you buy equipment for one dish and you never use it again. It's a waste of money, a waste of time. But he still has his chip on his shoulder. He wants to prove to everybody that he can do everything. He can be everything. And this has driven him to be considered one of the absolute best young chefs in America. But that's when that bumps up against the realities of the producer, his uncle, who's funding all this. And he's asking, where is the money? My tables are full, but where's the money? This is like a blockbuster film that gets a lot of critical raves, potentially, or maybe a mixed critical reaction. We still don't even know that for sure. And might sell a lot of movie tickets, but the production costs and the advertising costs and the back-end participation is so massive that this thing can never make money. The more money it makes, the more money it bleeds. And of course, that's another thing that's being explored here. Both of these themes, the stresses of a startup, basically. Everybody's going to have a different level of commitment, and that's going to lead to internal tensions within the team members themselves. And then finally, is it better to specialize in something and become really good at one thing, or do you need to be all things to all people? Because in the end, if you try to be all things to all people, you're going to disappoint them. And once again, a metaphor for this show. I think this is a show that appeals to different audiences for different reasons. And by trying to appease all of them, maybe this show is not the best version of itself. And maybe it's kind of aware of those limitations. In episode 4, Marcus continues to deal with the fallout from the death of his mother. As I mentioned before, really great performance here by this actor. But this episode begins to feel not necessarily overstuffed, but you can feel the mechanics of the season trying to fill itself out. And at this point, episode 1 really strong, episode 3 really strong. Maybe not coincidentally the episodes where there's the least of these fill in the blanks interactions between the characters, especially these really stressful interactions followed by potentially comedic, hit and miss for me, how well the comedy works in a lot of these interactions. And then episode 4 is another one of these bumps, the rougher episodes. There's a lot of plot set up here. Sydney gets approached by another chef in the street. He's thinking of opening a new restaurant. This is a new opportunity for her. She has been offered, by the way, a partnership in The Bear. There is an agreement that she has not reviewed, will not e-sign, and that lingers over this entire series. Of course, she's wondering, do I want to commit to this? This is extremely stressful. Does Carmi really respect her? And even if he does, on paper, respect her, can he get out of his own way and let other people take more ownership of this thing that he has built? And of course, it goes back to my commentary. If you haven't seen that, check out the conversation I had with Sona last week for the preview to this. But in season 2, of course, the finale there, things have gone exceptionally well on that opening night, but Carmi can't see that. He can only see his limitations. And Sydney, of course, is wondering, can he ever get out of his own way? Can I ever be a true partner here? Of course, that's a huge part of the plot of this season. What is she going to do? On the more awkward side, they're putting a lot on Richie, the character, to bring some of the heart and the discovery that the absolutely extraordinary episode from last season, Forks, that the Richie character brought there. And once again, it's hit and miss to take something that's a bit of a side dish, a predominant one, but nonetheless a big side component, and maybe focusing the show a little too much around him. Another awkward thing about this, or less successful, in my opinion, is once again stunt casting. Everybody has to be stunt casted. And his ex-wife's fiance ends up being Josh Hartnett. And here's a show that in season 1 is giving us character actors that have not acted before, have rarely acted before, are seasoned actors that have had very little TV exposure at all. So new to us as viewers, aside from Jeremy Allen White, of course. And now as the show has progressed, every single secondary, tertiary character has to be a that guy. Not only a that guy, almost all people who were mildly to hugely famous currently or historically. And hey, I'm all in favor. Josh Hartnett was terrific in Oppenheimer. He's in the new M. Night Shyamalan movie coming out next month. I'm 100% in favor of this renaissance in his career. A big fan of his, especially now that as he's aged. But we don't need to have every celebrity that is having any kind of cultural moment to be a cameo here on the show. And that goes to the Fack brothers, the Fack family, I guess it's extended, where we have John Cena. Again, I love John Cena. Who doesn't love John Cena? A big guy who can have fun with his persona nonetheless. I love him on Peacekeeper. We are actually getting a second season of Peacekeeper, by the way. Just throw another pin in that. Put it on your watch list. But do we need another distraction, having another hugely famous person walk into this series? And I'm going to spend another moment on this. I wasn't planning on it, but you think back on season 1, that Mikey was this larger-than-life character. And you have these little-known character actors. Even Jeremy Allen White, very recognizable from Shameless, but not the lead in Shameless necessarily. I guess for some of the seasons, yes. But in general, not the type of person who you're thinking you're going to hang a whole series on. And of course, they have very successfully done so here. So when you're surprised to see the hugely charismatic John Bernthal, who's very recognizable, he hasn't been in any blockbuster franchises or anything, but a very memorable that guy. We all know who he is. When you realize in flashback that that's who Mikey was, of course it should be a celebrity because it looms so large in his memory. Now by having every Joe Schmo who walks into the show be a famous person, it really diminishes the whole punch that Mickey is as this movie star. Basically, the big persona should be movie stars because, of course, that is the whole point of casting in a series. But having everybody... Better Call, Saul is your stepfather and Laurie Strode is your mom and Gillian Jacobs is the ex and John Mulaney is one of the cousins and Sarah Paulson is another cousin. Olivia Colman, incredible, by the way, such a great performance. And Will Poulter in such a small role. I mean, do we need... Molly Ringwald shows up as an Al-Anon person. There's too much. I understand why they want to be there. I understand why the showrunners want to work with these people. I just don't think it improves the show. Okay, I'm being overly negative, by the way, on this. It's not as distracting as all that. I just feel like it's a self-inflicted wound. We don't need to lean so heavily on the stunt casting. Back to the plot here in the 4th episode. After that huge digression on Tiff's fiance, Frank, played by Josh Hartnett. Despite all that, this actually is a pretty touching interaction, specifically when you see Richie talking about whether maybe he should step away. Maybe it is weird with this new family, and maybe he is isolating himself, although there are maybe some indications here that he may have a new romantic interest. I do hope, whether that is true or not, that Richie lands okay, because Richie really is in a moment, even in season 1, of sheer terror of losing this thing that is so important to him. And of course, after losing his family, that's something that this season of the show does really well, is really giving us the psychology of these different characters. And in very subtle ways, this is where the show is at its strongest, is understanding Richie more. Richie is a very annoying character to me in season 1, by the way. And then I fell in love with him. I know everybody in America fell in love with him in season 1. I fell in love with him in season 2 when he started this redemption arc. And now I'm a little concerned for him because we've discovered that, of course, it's not only losing Mikey, it's not only losing this only job he has basically ever known, and of course, having lost his wife and daughter, or the relationship at least, although his wife is very much concerned for him, rather lovingly, and bring him into the fold of great interactions between this father and the actress playing his daughter, this young actress. You really feel like there is a tenderness there in their relationship, probably between the two actors as well. And the hook at the end of episode 4, of course, is that they find out that not only is there going to be a write-up from the Chicago Tribune, a very important review, that it's already happened. The reason that they are bringing a photographer there to photograph the food is because they're going to run a review because they have already been there. Episode 5 is called Children, and when I was watching it, it made sense to me that it was called Children, and now I'm not sure why. In retrospect, the big thing that happens here is that Cicero shows up with his friend, the computer. This is the bean counter, the producer, showing up with the Hollywood bean counter to say, why do we need this? So why are we spending so much on this? Shouldn't we simplify the menu? Shouldn't we buy this in bulk? Why are we buying one-off equipment? So very rational decisions he's making. He also asks them to add an additional half turn to make the thing profitable. And they also need to make the sandwiches more efficient because the sandwich delivery is actually what's basically funding the rest of the restaurant. So all good advice, but of course very practical and not what Carmi necessarily wants to hear. As any purely creative type doesn't want to ever hear about logistical realities, even though in the back of his mind, he's always thinking about how long can I keep this thing afloat? I'm certain. And of course, adding pressure and stress to all of this circumstance is that they find out that Chef Terry, played by Olivia Colman, is shutting down her restaurant ever. And of course, if Carmi has this good dad or good mom, bad dad dichotomy that he's trying to resolve in his mind, if the role model for the kinder, gentler version of the restaurant is Chef Terry, and she can't make this thing work, potentially, that may not be her true motivations, but if he's worried, why is she shutting down the restaurant? Then what is the possibility of the bear succeeding long term? Okay, episode 6, another highlight of the season. Episode 1, a highlight. Episode 3, a highlight. Episode 4 and 5, a little rough, although 5 worked a little bit better for me than 4. Episode 6, another highlight. Focusing, as they did last season, on a single character. But instead of showing, for example, Tina's excellent episode last season where she goes to culinary school, we hear her do a beautiful karaoke performance. In this case, we see what led up to her being hired at Beef. She loses her job. She had an office job. Very interesting to explore a few different themes here. When you think about the Tina we know now, to create this backstory that we were not familiar with, we may have assumed, or I did anyway, that Tina had been working in restaurants for decades potentially and had worked her way up to this position. And that's why she kind of had this cockiness about someone else coming in. What we actually see here is that she worked an office job and now she's working this restaurant job, but she likes it because she likes the people. And she also has this chip on her shoulder when Sydney shows up because she, as she mentions in this episode, sees all these young people taking all these jobs that she should be getting, these entry-level jobs in other offices, and simultaneously wanting to slap them across the face, but envying them for they can do anything because they don't know their limitations. And this is a great metaphor. I've had this conversation with my nephew that's kind of the great thing about being young is that you have this incredible confidence and all your dreams are probably not going to play out the way you expect or almost certainly will not. But there's this unlimited reserve of cockiness and confidence because you just don't know what you don't know. And it's why we admire the young, even though they can be incredibly selfish, annoying people. Not my nephews, though. They're great. I'm just saying in general. But another interesting and powerful moment here is she, of course, ends up after going on this one last failed job interview. She meets up with Mikey. Oh, before I get to that, I want to mention that here we are in New York City. We see Succession. We see these people who live in New York and have these high power, high profile jobs. But for every one of those billionaires, there are thousands, tens of thousands of people who are having very common jobs, who potentially have very successful, decades-long careers living in the city, who suddenly have this tenuous potential loss of status because a job disappears, something as simple as that. And also the idea that Tina, for example, just wants a job. She just wants to contribute. She just wants to have something to do every single day. She just wants to feel like a part of society. And she envies her husband, who can get not only one job, but two jobs. And even he is looking for a promotion as a doorman to basically manage the other doormen. That's all it is. A lifetime of doing concierge service at a building, basically, and security as well, but a relatively low profile person, the type of people who don't get TV series made about them, basically. My dad was a construction worker. My mom was a seamstress. So they worked in these type of fields, these invisible jobs. And the people that they hung out with that were in our social circle also had these type of jobs. And oftentimes they were immigrants. They were just happy to have jobs, just to be able to put food on a table. And that was a satisfying enough expectation. And all of that is to say that here is someone who lost her status of working in a job for many decades, who then ended up, in a way, demoting herself to work at a restaurant, almost, an entry-level job that pays her probably significantly less than she was making before. But now, of course, you think how this drives her, because now she is in a job that she accidentally fell into, but now she can be great. She can be great at something else, even late in her life. And we see this dynamic here, and it's really excellently conveyed in this particular episode, which is one of the strongest of the season. Okay, and then finally, of course, she ends up at the beef. She gets offered a job by Mikey. We get to see Mikey here. And once again, what the show is able to do so well, filling in the blanks in ways you don't expect. After season 1, season 2, I'm thinking Mikey is a loser. He ran the business into the ground. He's an addict. He was jealous of Carmi's skill and success. And in rewatching season 1 with my wife, when she finally saw it just recently, in rewatching season 1, I had even more questions about why Mikey had rejected Carmi. Was it just jealousy? I just didn't understand. More so than the first time I saw the show and just kind of accepted it. Anyway, in just this one interaction, this is beautifully filled out. We now see, unbeknownst to us, of course, Sugar and Carmi and Mike's dad is now in the picture. We find out that he ran off, basically. He had either opened or inherited this restaurant. He had run the business into the ground and had disappeared. Couldn't deal with it, walked away, left the family to deal with this. Mikey didn't have a career, didn't have a trajectory, didn't have a passion of his own. He inherited this reluctantly, but in the end, he kind of fell in love with it because he loved the people. And all of this makes this pathology or psychology of Mike even more tragic, or significantly more tragic than it was upon first blush. Because think about it, he has inherited this. The family has this expectation of him. He has his own personal demons, probably exacerbated by this additional pressure on himself. He wants this thing to work. It's not something he's passionate about. Carmi does have this passion, and he envies him that. He wants him to go away, because Carmi, that is, because he wants him to get away from this trap he has found himself in. But even though he is trapped, he still kind of likes, or has grown to like, this job, but feels also the pressure that everybody's eyes are on him. He needs to be successful to subsidize his mom, to subsidize his siblings potentially. And in that case, you imagine that it's the pressure of all of this that may have led to his suicide, which is really sad, right? Because now in this case, it's not someone who's self-destructive. It's someone who had these expectations foisted upon them and could not escape these circumstances and came to an extremely dramatic resolution, unfortunately. And then leaves the restaurant to his brother, maybe seeing in Carmi, despite his passion and his drive, some of the same stressors that were piling up on him. And he had always wanted this restaurant, and maybe saying, well, here you go, Carmi. And of course, trying to set him up with success by basically stealing the money from Cicero, although that didn't end up being enough money. But hey, if it had stayed at Sandra's shop, it probably would have done fine. And then that becomes the question too. It's like, how much is Carmi's ambition itself the limitation of his success? So all these thoughts, as we're just seeing the plot play out and these interactions playing off, all these thoughts are in my mind. And I thought this is the show near the peak of its quality, where it's able to raise all these issues and develop these characters and surprise us with their histories all at the same time. Really well done. Episode 7 is another awkward, I think, episode in the show, although it has some strong points. This one's called Legacy. Sydney, of course, is now offered straight up partnership in this theoretical new restaurant by the Adam character, who wants everything to be in the open. He doesn't want to be like, I don't want this to be a straight up poaching. I want to talk to Carmi. But of course, she doesn't want that conversation to happen either, because she is still in this in between, this limbo of, does she want to double down with Carmi, or does she want to try this new experiment with someone who, at least whether she respects his cooking as much, does want to see her as a full partnership? So will her ideas have more of a voice there? Obviously, a question we ask ourselves all the time when we decide what our next career choices would be. This is pretty uneven, and once again, trying to move the plot along in different parallel streams. I think the strongest element here is, as Marcus has been reviewing Carmi's beautiful diaries, illustrated diaries, as he's been to all these different restaurants, he talks about how these chefs in their restaurants, how the way they run their restaurants is part of their legacy. So over and over again, I keep thinking that this series is about Carmi trying to find a parental figure. He obviously has, his dad walked away from the family. His brother rejected him when he wanted to go into business with him. His mother is untrustworthy. The family itself, the dynamic, is always so abusive and so self-centered that it drives everybody to be protective, to also be petty and self-centered. And the only way for him to have evolved was for him to step away. And of course, now he's stepping back in. We saw a flashback earlier in the season to him attending his brother's funeral, missing the call when his brother was found, unable to actually go into the church for the funeral. And of course, like everybody in the family, he probably was so insulated, so in his own mind, so resentful of what he wasn't getting from them that he somehow missed this. And they all missed it, right? But what is the correct parenting style? What is the correct way to run your restaurant? These are what Carmi is conveying to Marcus, and maybe even lacking in some self-awareness here during this conversation. Also, a very nice touch here is, as I mentioned earlier, that they have streamlined the delivery of the sandwiches. Ibra had been making the sandwiches, putting them together, serving them to the customers, running the cash register, and his job had just become a total grind. But then by bringing in some of the old workers that used to do exactly this every single day, he can just focus on making the sandwiches, and he is loving his job again. And this is maybe the seed of where the next season is going to be, a season that they've already shot, I believe, and could speak to some of the limitations of this season. And I'll get to it by the time I get to the end here. But Ibra's newfound or rediscovered joy in making the sandwiches is maybe the model that the rest of the staff needs to look at, to think about, focus on the thing you're excellent at, subtract the other things that are extraneous, and then maybe rekindle your passion for what you started off with. And of course, can't mention the fact that Natalie needs to just go outside. It's such a nice day. She's going to go pick up the napkins. They're always out of napkins. She's going to go pick up the napkins at Restaurant Depot, and picking up that one big box pushes her into labor. I would probably take a break from the show before I jump into episode 8. Some things about this show are good in a binge. For example, with season 1, I may have dropped off of the show if it wasn't available as a binge, because certain aspects of it annoyed me so much. And then I kind of realized that that trolling that I described that comes earlier in the season pays off at the end. And I probably wouldn't have just come back week to week. Season 2, so those episodes were so strong that I really felt like they could have gone week to week, and people would have talked about them. It's, oh, have you seen that yet? Oh my God, did you see fishes? Oh my God, did you see spoons? Oh my God, did you see omelet? Right? So all these episodes would have if anything, made the show even more viral, I think, potentially. Although it's been so successful, maybe not. But if you have the option, I would take a break after episode 7 and then come back to the show, because binging it through, the show definitely started to grate on me a little bit towards the end. And it begins with this episode 8, even though I really think that episode 8 ends pretty beautifully. Okay, episode 8 is like a microcosm of everything I don't like about the show and everything I do like about the show all in once. And this episode of the show is trolling me. I have a feeling, I feel like I should say that a lot of these episodes directed by Christopher Storer end up being trolls for me, because sometimes he gives me exactly what I want. Sometimes he intentionally subverts. It's like the experience I'm having of watching this is very personal to me in some ways. One of the non-negotiables earlier on was that everybody has to put their cell phones away during their service shift, which makes perfect sense. Phones can be very distracting, especially in this type of high intensity work environment, which means, of course, that when Sugar goes into labor, everybody's phones are turned off. So she has to turn to the person that she least wanted to turn to, her mother. And this is when Jamie Lee Curtis's character re-enters Donna. And right at the start of the episode, when Donna shows up, it's just like nails on a chalkboard to me, which of course is the intention. And the show's almost too good at this, because I want to fast forward through some of these scenes, honestly, because it's not just like a funny, heightened version of this type of person, like an Everybody Loves Raymond or something. It is a truly annoying energy that she brings to the show on purpose. And of course, as I said, this is a very trolling thing. It continues as they're finally in the hospital, as she's telling her to breathe, make the sound he. All of this is just grating to me. And then, of course, as expected, this longer episode has this pivot point when the mom and the daughter, finally all the pretenses down, all their inhibitions down. They just have an honest conversation when she was born, what the mother went through, without all of the performative aspects of her neuroses. And Natalie just stopping this pressure she has on herself to always try to accommodate her mother and rejecting her outright as soon as she irritates her. And they just have this conversation. And finally, Pete arrives, and it's very sweet. This whole ending is very strong. The facts show up. Everything works here at the end of this episode. The facts sometimes were a little annoying to me. I like them here in these moments with Donna, someone they've known their whole entire lives. I like Pete and Natalie's dynamics, very sweet. I like Pete's interaction with Donna as well. I like Donna making amends with her daughter after conveying over the course of the episode all the different birthing experience she had with the different siblings. And then we get to the last 2 episodes of the show, which I think are the most problematic. Episode 9 is called Apologies, and it's really about Carmi trying to basically have the courage to apologize to Claire. He wants her back. He's thinking about her all the time. There's this concept the facts have of being haunted by somebody, which just means that bad things just continuously seem to happen. Someone might be doing it to you. They start to speculate that maybe Claire is haunting Carmi. They decide to go and make the apologize on his behalf, to apologize on his behalf. Carmi invites Sydney to come to this funeral for the Ever restaurant. She's reluctant to, because she knows she's got this tension. She's probably going to run into Adam while she's there. So all of this makes her feel awkward. You can tell she's just nervous around Carmi in general. And Cicero tells Carmi, as kind of an out, if the restaurant review's not a hit, he's going to have to shut down the restaurant. But then in his conversation with the computer back in the car, we discover that it's actually more dire than that. Cicero's lost money on the market. I don't know if it's the housing market or the stock market. And it really doesn't matter if marginally Carmi's making 5% more, 10% more, even if they are able to tighten their belts. He simply cannot float the business. And this is going to set up one of the cliffhangers for the season, one of many cliffhangers, by the way. A lot of things here are repetitive. One is that we see Richie and Tiffany again talking about whether he's going to go to the wedding or not. I don't know. We needed this scene, honestly. He's said most of these things previously already. I do like the fact that Tiffany says, I don't have any family anymore. You're kind of my family, which is an interesting dynamic for your ex to have that put on them. And she even says it. She goes, I don't care if you are uncomfortable. I need you to be there. Sydney has confirmation, by the way, by talking to Pete, who's a lawyer and has reviewed the contract. And it turns out that she would actually be making less money, be getting less benefits. So on paper, the bear seems to be the worst of the two options for her, making this split decision for her even more difficult. Or perhaps on paper, making it not a split decision at all. Another thing that's repetitive here, at the top of the episode, we do see Carmi trying to apologize, and we hear this tense soundtrack music overlapping with this REM song that was a love theme with him and Claire. And this was really grating for me also. A lot of the technique in this particular episode is leaning a little too much into this bag of tricks that the series has come up with. And this one was maybe the one I was least impressed with, I would say. And that leads us to the finale, called Forever. Phew, we made it to the finale. I honestly did not think this was going to go all 10 episodes in this recap, but I just kept talking somehow. And here we are. In the episode, really strong episode, technically, and in most ways, except for the finale. I'll get to that. We see Carmi at French Laundry. Thomas Keller, the actual Thomas Keller, gives him some tips on preparing the chicken. Once again, this idea of parents and choosing your role model as a parent, a big theme here, obviously, in the show. And Richie and his daughter, obviously, being just another element of this. Sydney and her father, yet again. Sugar's anxiety about being a good mother. Donna's reconciliation with her kids. This is all part of our legacy, right? As people that we are concerned with, what we leave behind, and that is our children primarily, but not exclusively. Obviously, what we make, what we build, is also what we leave behind. And Carmi, once again, gets to see all his parents in one place. We have Thomas Keller here in flashback, giving him some really beautiful advice, like honestly good life lessons. If this is how he actually talks, I hope this is a legitimate representation of him as a chef and as a teacher, to always embrace the experience and the people as part of that experience. And of course, counterpointed to Chef Terry, who got everything she wanted. She built the restaurant. She made this place. She had a reputation. And now she wants to live her life. She wants to hang out with her friends. She wants to go on vacations. She wants to travel around the world. I think we all feel that as well too, right? Like, when is time when you've achieved enough and you just want to experience the rest of the world? And also at this restaurant is David Fields, who ran the restaurant called David, I believe, in New York. That has been hinted at multiple times here across these seasons of the show, played by Joel McHale. And Carmi's just staring him down the entire time, and then eventually confronts him. And once again, this idea of a good parent, bad parent, he confronts David and says to him how he made his life miserable. And David goes, "I made you who you are today." And Carmi can't even deny it to some extent. We have seen repeatedly that Carmi needs this undue pressure he puts on himself to really light his fire. He wants to be like Chef Terry, but he really is like David Fields. And I don't think Carmi can deny that might have been his biggest motivator. He was always running away from his family. It was a negative reinforcement to say, "Oh yeah, I'll show you." And that is what David reinforced within him. And that very well may have been the thing that drove him forward. And now he is doing that. That is the legacy he is building in his restaurant by ignoring Sydney's recipe recommendations, by changing the menu, her menu, over and over again. And of course, it's the fact that when he corrects her recipe, goes, "Actually, we'll do it this way," she will accept the fact that you're probably right. That's the better way to go. And yet, she says, "Even if I'm wrong, can you let me make the experiment?" Which, of course, is what happened with David as well, with that one scallop, I believe that scallop recipe that he's trying to perfect that whole entire time with the blood orange. By the way, bringing this all the way full circle, of course, we find out in the very first episode that when Sydney went to New York and ate at David, that the modification to the recipe, David had basically stolen Carmi's recipe, had made his corrections, just like Carmi does, but then said, "Okay, now that's mine." Carmi goes back to his original version, and in this serendipitous way, the season's coming full circle, him recognizing that that's what was done to him. That's what Sydney's asking for. But of course, Sydney was the person who had the modified recipe, his original intention. And that is the thing that catalyzed for her need to be a chef. The episode culminates with a party back at Sydney's place. She only has frozen waffles, but Chef Terry turns it into something. And this is a really fun, boisterous culmination of a lot of the themes in this season of show. Sydney is still trying to weigh out whether she wants the new offer or to stay with Carmi. She remembers the original 5-star rating for the beef in the Chicago Tribune, starts to panic. If the review is not as good, what does that mean about the changes that have taken place? And then the final moments here are very confusing to me. It looks like Carmi is missing a bunch of notifications. Cicero's calling him. His accountant is calling him, the computer as they call him. And there's a notification, a Google alert. The review is out. And from the flashes we see on the screen, it looks like it's mixed. It's messy, ambitious, talented, all over the place. A mixed review, of course. What does that mean? And hey, meta, everybody. A meta narrative here around this show. What does a mixed review of this season of television have to say about The Bear? Doesn't say much because they've already greenlit a 4th season. They've already shot a 4th season, and we'll probably get it sooner rather than later. Okay, my critiques here at the end, despite a lot of strength here in this final episode, is all the cliffhangers. We now have to wait to see what is Sydney going to do. Do they have to shut down the restaurant? If they do, if Cicero tells him that, then he should really just tell Sydney and Sydney can walk away. Does he get back together with Claire? Can he find work-life balance? Can any of us find work-life balance? And that's where we end things with season 3. All right, what's going to be in season 4? I'm just guessing here. Do they shut down the restaurant? As I'm doing this recap, I'm thinking, is there a version of this where they do have to shut down the restaurant, but then beef could just become a smaller version of itself, a food truck? Can Carmi reconnect with what made everybody fall in love with the restaurant in the first place? Taking what Mikey built and his father before him and just elevating it. Maybe that's the direction this goes in. Maybe Sydney should leave, although who's to say that Adam's really going to be a better boss than Carmi or a more collaborative one? I do think there'll be some more reconciliation. This grandchild is going to bring the family some kind of closure. There'll be a wedding, of course, next season. Fewer funerals, more weddings next season. So that's my guess. I am more positive in binging this show, and I do think that everybody should take that break, like I mentioned, near the midway point, or maybe a little bit past the midway point. Take a breather. Don't have such high expectations for this thing. There is, I believe in episode 9, perhaps, at the very beginning, there's this YouTube video you can actually see from Ricky J that talks about the history of magic and how magic requires some kind of surprise. And that's a really almost impossible achievement, is when people know they're going to see a magic trick and yet are fooled. And if season 1 of The Bear was this unexpected surprise, season 2 of The Bear did exactly that in setting the bar so high and somehow clearing it to everyone's possible expectations. Season 3 doesn't do that. Expectations even more heightened. People really feeling like this thing's going to save television. The expectations are just way too high. And it doesn't meet that. But even just a day removed and having this reassessment of the show, I like it a lot more. And I do hope that the critics and the fans do come around to it. And maybe I'll rewatch it relatively soon and see how I feel about it. And I'll be having that conversation with Sona and reflecting upon all these things and really interested to see what her reaction is going to be to this, and maybe the general audience's reaction as well. Sona and I oftentimes have very different perspectives on the things we're watching. That's why I like to bring her in as a different point of view. She doesn't overthink things usually the way I do. So interesting to see how different audiences react to this. Okay, so stay tuned. Additional conversations about The Bear, at least one more, and upcoming content discussing Presumed Innocent, this mid-season check-in, and then, of course, end of season as well. And there's some new series coming this month as well. We'll introduce them in the next week or two. Follow me on Letterboxd. Email me. Love to hear your feedback. Need some introduction at gmail.com. If you'd like to support the show, best thing you can do is recommend this to your friends and family. Post this on your socials. The more people who listen to us, the more people follow us, and the more motivated I am to put out this content. Thanks for listening, everybody. I hope you love the show, even if it stumbled a little bit this season. And I'll talk to you soon.